Hello, Moscow. Greetings. Hi, I wish I could be there with you in person right now, but I'm glad that I could at least have the chance to share some of my work on Kant with you from afar. So first off, I want to thank the organizers of the conference for giving me the chance to speak with you all today. I look forward to sharing some of my work, and I appreciate the time slot that I've been given. So my time is short, so I'll get right to work here. But what I want to talk about has to do with some of my recent work regarding my phenomenalist interpretation of Kant's transcendental idealism. More specifically, my view is a position that I refer to as intentional object phenomenalism. It's also sometimes called intentionalism in the literature. But the basic idea here is that I think that when Kant talks about empirical objects as mere appearances, mere phenomena, which are representations that are in us, what he really means by these claims is that these empirical objects are mere intentional objects. So by that I mean that these empirical objects are merely what is purported by certain of our complex cognitive representational states. They're the intentional correlates, as it were, of our cognitions. They're the contents of our thinking. But they don't have any existence aside from that. And so, strictly speaking, I want to claim that these empirical objects don't really exist. They don't have any positive ontological status of their own. Their existence, such as it is reducible entirely to the fact that they are what is purported by our representations. Okay, so it's a strong metaphysical reading of idealism. I'm not going to try to defend this view today. I just want to talk about a problem that arises within the interpretation. First off, though, just to make sure that my view is vivid, you can contrast this intentional object phenomenalism with what we might think of as traditional or ontological or perhaps Berkeleyan phenomenalism. So traditional phenomenalism is the view that empirical objects are mere collections of mental states. So the apple is, a collection of the color sensation and the shape sensation and the taste sensation and so on. And so the object, the apple, for instance, really just is a collection of sensations in the mind. That's Berkeley's view. That's not my view, though, or that's not my interpretation of Kant. Rather, my claim is that the object, for instance, an apple, is not the mental state itself. It's rather the referent, or, well, the intentional object, what is referred to within the representation. Okay. So that's how you can contrast my intentional object phenomenalism with a more traditional phenomenalism. I'm not the only person to defend a view like this. You can find other proponents in the writings of Richard Aquila, James Van Cleve, Hope Robinson, Johannes Haag, and others I could mention too. It is a minority position, but there are a few of us out there making the case for the view, and I think it has a good shot at being the right answer. Now, usually when people complain about intentional object phenomenalism, their complaints have to do with it being too close to Berkeley. They worry that phenomenalism will always undermine Kant's empirical realism. I've addressed those broader concerns in a previous paper that I published last year in Kantian Review. And today, instead, I want to talk about a problem that I don't think has really been adequately discussed in the literature about this kind of phenomenalism. And the problem has to do with what it could mean, according to the intentional object phenomenalist, to say of a mere intentional object that it exists or that it's actual. What would ever justify an existential judgment about a mere intentional object? I mean, keep in mind what I just said a minute ago. I said earlier that, strictly speaking, these mere intentional objects don't exist. And so you might just say that you could never truthfully or veridically say of a mere intentional object that it does exist. And so you might reasonably worry that the intentional object phenomenalist reduces the entire world to a mere subjective illusion. It's all just, appearances in the loose, empty sense. Nothing is real. All we're perceiving is one, veil of ideas, and there's no truth behind it. That can't be Kant's view, right? Kant was adamantly an empirical realist. Kant believed that empirical objects, physical objects, exist outside the mind in the way described by physics, by science. And so if it were true that intentional object phenomenalism reduced the world to a mere subjective illusion, then as an interpretation of Kant, the view is certainly a failure. So I need some way out of this. I need a way to fix the problem. Now, you can begin to respond to this worry by saying, well, look, when the intentional object phenomenalist claims that these objects are mere intentional objects, That claim is being made from the transcendental standpoint. Transcendentally speaking, from the big picture of Kantian theory, these objects don't, strictly speaking, exist. But that's consistent with claiming within the empirical standpoint that we are nevertheless sometimes justified in making judgments of actuality regarding empirical objects. And so you might say then that empirical objects can still be real in the sense that we are justified in judging them to be actual. So that's all well and good, but that kind of solution is only going to work if we can give some content to the notion of actuality. We have to specify what exactly Kant thinks is going on when we judge of an object in empirical cognition that it is actual or that it exists. And so that's what I want to try to elaborate on today. So the obvious and first place that we should look when talking about the category of actuality is, of course, the postulates of empirical thinking in general, where Kant explicitly talks about actuality and the category of actuality. So here's his first account of actuality. He says that that which is connected with the material conditions of sensation is actual. Okay, so far so good. It sounds like, and Kant is, drawing a tight connection between the actuality of an object and the fact that some perceiver has a sensation of the object. Okay, now on its face, that might sound, to put Kant, dangerously close to the Berkeleyan doctrine that to be is to be perceived. But that can't be right. That's not the full story for Kant, because as he goes on to elaborate in the postulates, he gives a fuller story, and he says, look, in general, actual objects have a connection with some actual perception in accordance with the analogies of experience, which exhibit all real connection in an experience in general. So what Kant is getting at here is the idea that something is actual, yeah, if it's sensed directly, but something can also be actual even if it isn't directly perceived, so long as this unperceived thing has some sort of coherent and cognizable law-like causal connection to what we do directly perceive. So for instance, Kant talks about magnetic fields. Magnetic fields are not directly perceivable, but the effects of magnetic fields are perceivable, metallic objects moving about in certain ways. So even though you cannot directly perceive a magnetic field, we are still justified in judging magnetic fields to be actual, because positing magnetic fields is necessary to make full sense of the causal interrelations of objects in the natural world. So Kant is not like Berkeley. The view is not to be is to be perceived. Rather, it's more like to be is to be perceived and to be in a law-like causal connection to everything else that is perceived. So that gives us something like the following as a principle of actuality as the stated doctrine of the postulates. The view is that an object is actual if and only if it can be represented as in law-like causal connection to the rest of the sensible objects in the world. Right? Actuality consists in being a member in the causal nexus of all the different interacting objects that constitute the entire physical empirical reality. Okay. Now that's the view of the postulates on its face. But what is the intentional object phenomenalist going to say about this principle? Well, honestly, we don't have to do a lot of work to translate this principle into the language of intentional objects. And so here is a quick modification of it. I'll qualify and modify this principle later, but it'll do for now. The view seems to be that a mere intentional object is actual if and only if it can be represented as in law-like causal connection to the rest of the mere intentional objects which have antecedently been judged to be actual. So what we have here is a kind of coherentist story about actuality. What makes an object like my cup here actual is the fact that when I represent the cup, I represent it as in law-like causal connections to the other objects around me. So for instance, when I touch it, it causes certain tactile sensations in my hand. I represent the cup as being held down to the desk by causal laws regarding gravity and so on. And so really it's in causal connection with the rest of the earth. And it's because I can trace these causal connections between the cup and the rest of the objects around me that I am justified in deeming the cup to be actual. And note that in judging the cup to be actual, I'm really not saying anything beyond the fact that I can draw these causal connections in my broader representation. So for instance, I'm not saying that the cup is really there, metaphysically or ontologically speaking. And in general, this account of actuality doesn't really have any metaphysical or ontological content to it at all. This principle of actuality is just about the kinds of representational connections you can draw between the various objects that constitute the natural world. Well, okay. So with this account of actuality in place, we can start to sketch a distinction between actual and non-actual objects, at least regarding certain what I'll call easy cases. So here's a passage from the Prolegomena where Kant talks about a certain class of non-actual objects. For instance, the things that you see in dreams or illusions or hallucinations. Kant says that the difference between truth and dream, however, is decided through their connection according to the rules that determine the combination of representations in the concept of an object and how far they can or cannot stand together in one experience. Okay, so the idea here is that if I have a dream, and in my dream I have a dream of like an illusory, unreal cup or whatever I'm dreaming about. What makes the objects that I see in dreams not actual, not real, is the fact that when I wake up, I'm not able to draw causal connections between the objects perceived in dreams and the rest of the objects that I see in the world. It's exactly because dreamt objects and hallucinated objects and illusory objects do not have causal connections to the rest of the world that I can say that they're not actual. Okay, so yeah, we are now able to draw a principal distinction between the non-actual objects seen in the lawless chaos of dreams and the actual objects that can be represented as in coherent causal connections with the rest of the world. And so what I'm doing here is showing that we can draw a principal distinction between the actual and the non-actual. And I think that the only way to give real content to the notion of actuality is to show how we can draw those lines, right? If we can give a principal difference between what is actual and what is not actual, then we know what it really means to be actual. All right, so yeah, we've solved these easy cases about like, hallucinated objects and dreamt objects and so on. But now I want to turn to some more interesting and harder cases from the history of science. Because there's a problem that Kant didn't really seem to notice as far as I'm aware. And the problem is that there are some non-actual objects that actually can be coherently represented as in law-like causal connections with the rest of the world. So here are some examples. Caloric fluid, which I'll focus on in detail in a moment, but also the luminiferous ether that was thought to be like the medium through which light propagates 200 years ago. Phlogiston that was appealed to explain phenomena regarding combustion and fire and so on. The planet Vulcan that astronomers briefly thought existed in between Mercury and the sun. Right. There were good empirical reasons for postulating the existence of all of these things. And in fact, it was possible to talk about the causal connections between these scientific theoretical posits and the rest of the experienceable world. And so it looks like they did fit the definition of actuality. They could have been represented as in law-like causal connections to the rest of the world. So let's focus on caloric to see this point more vividly. Here is what Haslok Chang says about caloric in one of his discussions. He says, caloric was a self-repulsive or elastic or expansive substance while it was attracted to ordinary matter. When combined with the idea that temperature was the density of caloric, this basic system of forces yielded nice explanations of why heat tended to flow from warmer to colder places and why most things expanded when they were heated. Okay, so yeah, caloric was thought to be the substance that exists in different objects, and the more caloric there is in an object, the hotter it's going to be. Okay, and the heat in general was thought to be just identified with caloric. And so note that caloric was a full object in the strictly properly Kantian sense. It was extended in space, it had extensive magnitude, it had variable density, so it had intensive magnitude. It was a substance, and it had law-like causal connections to other objects. So it fits Kant's definition of what it is to be an object. And moreover, since it really did give good causal explanations for heat-related phenomena, it looks like it fit the definition not just of an object, but of an actual object. We were able to justifiably represent caloric as in law-like causal connections with the rest of the objects of the physical world. So here's the problem then. If caloric fits the definition of actuality, and if being actual is no more, there's nothing more to actuality than fitting the definition of the actual, then you might worry that the intentional object phenomenalist has to declare absurdly that caloric was actual, for a while. It was actual, say, in the 18th century when Lavoisier and others had good reason to theorize and talk about it. And then it ceased to be actual once we moved on and had a better theory of thermodynamics. But, I do think that would be absurd, right? I mean, certainly Kant would not have wanted to declare that something can just, exist because we had good reason to think it existed, and then it stops existing once we no longer have good reason to think it exists. So again, if this is the best that intentional object phenomenalism can do, then the theory is in trouble. Okay, so let's try to solve the problem then on behalf of the intentional object phenomenalist. So the way I'm going to try to sketch the solution is to first off appeal to what I'll call a conceptual scheme. Right, now, a conceptual scheme is going to be a way to represent the natural world, whether through science or through common sense or some combination of the two. But in general, a conceptual scheme is the structure through which we represent the world around us. Now in general, a conceptual scheme will involve two main parts. It'll have an ontology, and this ontology will include, first off, just what kinds of things there are, like the kinds of substances and so on, the basic natural kinds, as it were. And then also which specific objects of those kinds happen to be instantiated. And then the conceptual scheme will also involve a set of causal laws that govern the interactions of objects with each other. Okay. So that's what a conceptual scheme is. And then we can think about different kinds of conceptual schemes, some that match the evidence of perception, of sensation, of empirical data better than others. So for instance, some conceptual schemes won't match the empirical evidence at all. For instance, the conceptual scheme that represents, Earth as having 5 moons, or the conceptual scheme that represents gravity as being a repulsive force, something like that. Those obviously don't match the world as we experience it in sensation, so let's just ignore those. Some conceptual schemes, though, might fully fit, completely fit with empirical evidence, so far, or as best we can tell, as far as we've been able to investigate nature up to this point, we have a match between the data and a certain conceptual scheme. I'll call these temporarily adequate conceptual schemes. They're temporarily adequate for describing the world as we experience it. And so far, they fit the data of sensation, of perception. But we can also at least think about or contemplate the notion, however abstract, of a conceptual scheme that would fit all of the empirical evidence that could ever possibly be collected in all of nature. Imagine somebody who lives an infinitely long time and they research every nook and cranny, every corner of the entire universe. They look at all natural phenomena, large and small. They figure out all the different kinds of things that there are. And they put it all together into one big book of completed science. And they figure out the true story of the entire natural world. Right? We don't have such a theory right now, but we could at least imagine in outline the broad possibility of such a theory. You could say that an ideally adequate conceptual scheme would be a scheme that would fit all of the evidence as it was collected in this, book of completed science. And really, the notion of an ideally adequate conceptual scheme just is the notion of, total or complete science at the end of all inquiry into the natural world. Okay, so I want to use these notions of conceptual schemes now to modify my earlier gloss of the principle of actuality as understood by the intentional object phenomenalist. Okay, so first off, I note that Kant seemed to appeal only to what I've called a temporarily adequate conceptual scheme in the postulates. He seemed to suggest that it was good enough for an object to be actual, that it fits with the empirical evidence as we have it so far. But when you take a fuller view of the Critique of Pure Reason, you notice that some of his remarks in the appendix to the dialectic especially, but also earlier stuff, even in the A edition in the A edition deduction, he suggests that what he really thinks is required for actuality and for truth in our judgments about the world is closer to what I've described as an ideally adequate conceptual scheme. I don't have time right now to go into the textual evidence for this claim, but if anybody has any questions, just shoot me an email and I'd be more than happy to let you know what passages I have in mind. But Kant's full view does seem to be that true actuality has to do with what is described by an ideally, not merely temporarily, adequate conceptual scheme. So with that in mind, what I'm going to suggest is that we modify the previous definition of actuality. So here's the definition that I had earlier. I had said that a mere intentional object is actual if and only if it can be represented as in law-like causal connection to the rest of the mere intentional objects which have antecedently been judged to be actual. All right, let's tweak that a little bit, bringing in this notion of ideally adequate conceptual schemes. Here's the new version. A mere intentional object is actual if and only if it can be represented as in law-like causal connection to the mere intentional objects which would be represented by an ideally adequate conceptual scheme. The idea here is that what makes an object actual, or what actuality consists in, is the idea that it's an object that would be represented by a completed science, right? So if an object is of the kind that would have a place in, the final book of ideal completed science, then that object is actual. And so note that with this definition of actual, we now have a principal distinction not just between actual objects and the crazy stuff that you see in dreams, but rather between actual objects and all non-actual objects, even things like caloric, that might in certain cases have reasonably been judged to be actual. Okay, so this gives me then a solution to my main problem. We now have a principled way to draw the distinction completely between actual and non-actual objects, and we now do have the means to say that something like caloric or phlogiston or whatever was never actual to begin with, right? It was never actual to begin with, even though there might have been reason for a while to think that it was actual. So that's my main view. I'll just conclude with a couple of remarks here. There's actually quite a bit more to say. The full version of the paper has quite a few more, ins and outs and different conclusions that I want to draw. But I'll just make one point here to wrap things up, and it's a point about the scope of my claims here. So I want to point out that nothing that I've been saying so far is supposed to have been epistemological, in the sense that my account of actuality is not supposed to tell you how to tell the difference between what is actual and what is not actual. For that, you need to do empirical science. In order to know that caloric was never actual in the first place, we had to have people working on thermodynamics to figure out what heat really was, right? So do science if you want to know what is specifically actual or not. Rather, my point here has been merely semantic. I'm trying to explain what it means to call something actual. When we say of an object that it is actual, what do we take ourselves to be saying? And my claim at the end of the day is this: when I judge that something is actual, what I mean is that that something will be included in the final theory of nature, right? So my goal here has been to give an account of the semantics of actuality judgments, whereby it's possible to give content, give sense to the notion of actuality, while remaining completely inside of the intentional object phenomenalist framework, right? Talking only about representational contents and connections between representational contents. And I take myself to have done that. So is it possible for the intentional object phenomenalist to ever talk about empirical objects being actual? Yes, it is. And here's what you mean when you make a judgment along those lines. Okay, so that's it. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to hear my remarks about this. If anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to address them either in Skype if we have time for that, or if not, just feel free to send me an email. I have a fuller version, actually a quite long version of the paper that I'd be more than happy to send anybody to you, even though it's only in draft form. Either way, I hope the conference is going very well, and I hope you all have a very good evening. Take care.